start that ministry, before he can go, there it comes. Now I got to move the mic down because I'm going to blast your ears out there. Pickups are known for talking very loud, but Julia can attest. She's known me since first grade. She's known my family since first grade. She can attest to the loudness of the pickup family. So before Jesus can start that ministry of bringing God's kingship to earth, he has to first demonstrate that he will not fail the way that God's son Israel failed. If he is to be Israel's champion, if he is to be Israel's representative, then he has to go through his wilderness testing, and we'll have to see, is Satan going to master him the way that Satan mastered Israel, God's son, in the wilderness? And so that's what Matthew chapter 4 is all about. Jesus has been announced the Son of God, and so then Satan comes to say, what type of son will you be? Because God's son, Israel, failed. We'll see what Israel's champion or Israel's representative will do in the wilderness. And so last Sunday, we looked at the second temptation, and Jesus succeeded against Satan by refusing to test God. Satan had wanted Jesus to make God prove that he would protect Jesus. Sure, God promised it in Psalm 91, which is what Satan quotes in the second temptation. God promised he would protect his people, so Jesus jump off the temple, force God to do what he said he would do, have him prove it. Israel in the wilderness went through that same test and they failed. They tested God by saying, give us water to drink. Have God prove that he's really with us. But Jesus passed the test. He refused. He said, no, I'm not going to test God. I'm going to trust in God's promise. I'm not going to force him to show his protection. I'm just going to let him deliver his protection when he decides to do it, not when I decide he needs to do it. And so Jesus therefore passes that second test. And that brings us then to the third test in the wilderness. Let's go ahead and read it. Let's read the third test here in Matthew 4. And let's read verses 8 through 11. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to Jesus, all these I will give to you if you fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. Now, before we launch into the third test, there's one point I forgot to say last week. Remember in the second test, when Satan quotes Psalm 91 in verse 6, and Satan said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you. And a point I forgot to make last week is that, Psalm 91 promises that God will send his angels to minister, to protect his people. And Satan says, well, throw yourself down, have him prove it, have him show that. Jesus refuses, but don't miss what Matthew tells us in verse 11. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. In other words, God did what he said he would do in Psalm 91. He did it in his timing. Jesus wasn't going to test him and force him to act. But by waiting on God, God does keep his word and sends his angels to minister to Jesus. That's something I forgot to say last week. I want to make sure that we get that connection. So then, let's deal with the third test. So if you got your class books, again, we're on page 43, right at the very bottom of the page. 43, right at the bottom of the page. And here's our first question. And let me get your thoughts on this. What is Satan offering Jesus in this third temptation? What is he offering Jesus in the third temptation? What are your thoughts? Yeah, Jim, is your hand up? Or are you just relaxing?
Was made to Christ himself.
Yeah, so Jim just said, well, it seems to me that Satan is offering Jesus something that he already had, because if Jesus is the creator, how can Satan offer him then the kingdoms of the world? And certainly there is truth to what Mr. Jim has just said. There's truth to that. But I do think that what Matthew is presenting here is that there is another element of truth. Now how these relate to each other, we don't know, just as so many spiritual truths. But there is another truth to the fact that Satan is offering Jesus something that in a sense he doesn't have. Otherwise it wouldn't be a test. And notice that Jesus' retort to Satan is not, I already have this. This is all mine right now anyway. And so there is something in this offer that is a test to Jesus. And that's what I'm wanting us to see here and to examine. And that's why I've asked this question. Because we could answer this question and say, well, Satan's offering Jesus the kingdoms of the world. I mean, that's the easy answer. Not that it's false, it's just the easy one. But I want us to see deeper, yeah, but why is that a test? Why is Satan offering that to Jesus, and why would that be so tempting for Jesus to take advantage of this offer? What exactly is Satan how is he attacking Jesus here, in other words? What is he attacking? Anyone have a thought on that? Yeah, Robert? Yes. What Robert has just said is Satan is ultimately wanting worship here. And that's Jesus' response is no, we're only supposed to serve Yahweh, serve God. And so ultimately that's what Satan is wanting, which is certainly true. And we're going to come back to that thought here in just a minute. Yeah, Julia?
The world and their glory. And I think that's what the devil is trying to get him to see, that not only will he be in dominion of the kingdoms, but they will just glorify him. He'll be able to revel in the material wonders of the world. They'll fall down and worship him. And right now, he's about to go into Jerusalem. Eventually, he'll go into Jerusalem where they will spit at him and hit him and beat him. And he will, in a sense, have that glory eventually, but he's looking ahead in the present future and seeing mockery and shame.
Yes. I think what Julia has said is where I want to go. And I think that this is why this test is so important. And it's possibly why in Matthew's version, this is the last temptation. If you read Luke's gospel, there's a different order. It's the bread, turn the stones into bread, and then it's this test. It's the kingdoms of the world is the second test, and then Luke ends his temptation episode with the temple episode. And in Luke's gospel, the temple is a big theme, which is probably why he decided, I'm going to make this the last one. And possibly in Matthew's gospel, he's given us this order because in Matthew's gospel, a major focus, as we've talked about, is the kingdom of heaven, the reign of God. And so in this episode, you have this issue of kingdom, this issue of dominion, as Julia just said. But it's a question of how Jesus will accomplish that. How will Jesus reign? And so here's what I would submit to you, and this is summarizing, I think, the point that Julia just made. Satan is offering Jesus in this third test a way to glory and rulership without suffering. That's what he's offering Jesus. A way to glory and rulership without suffering. Remember, these tests are all about what type of a son are you going to be, Jesus? Because Israel was the son of God. but they failed. Let's see if you're going to do any better. You're supposed to be Israel's champion. You're supposed to be the fulfillment of Israel. Well, then let's see how you do with these same tests that Israel fell to in the wilderness. And don't make a mistake. In this third test, there's an omission. Satan doesn't say, if you are the Son of God in this third test, but it's just a logical omission, because it wouldn't make sense for Satan to say, if you are the Son of God, fall down and worship me. It doesn't make any sense. But make no mistake, this third test is just as much about Jesus' sonship as the previous two. What type of a son is this Israel going to be? This man who embodies Israel. And so think about what Satan is doing here. Jesus has already, in the first two tests, Jesus has already made it clear, I am willing to serve God, and I'm willing to trust in His deliverance, even if I have to suffer while I'm waiting for those things. I'm willing to suffer. And so now in this third test, Satan comes to Jesus, and he's basically saying, you don't have to go through all that suffering. I can give you the kingdoms and their glory. And I do think that's a key phrase, like Julia said. I can give you glory right now, right here. God's way is too hard. God's way involves the cross. Jesus knows that. I'll give it to you all right now. All you have to do is just worship me. That's why this is a test. It's because Satan is offering Jesus a way to bypass God's way of doing things so that he doesn't have to suffer to achieve God's glory. He can do it Satan's way. No suffering required. Kingdoms of the world are yours right here. You can have them. Just worship me. Yeah, Robert, go ahead.
I think this is absolutely correct. But I think you can take and their glory different ways.
How so?
Just like we're talking about here as one way. But in their glory could be all the riches and all the things that they possess.
Yes.
That's their glory, but it's their kingdom's glory.
Yes.
You can take it two different ways. It just shows you how steep this proposition was.
Yes.
Right? But Jesus saw
Great.
it way
Yeah.
to see this. But I think this is right on.
No, that's great. Robert has just given a complimentary point.
Which is weird.
That's right, which is weird. Their glory also includes, and Julia had mentioned this as well, and I didn't say this when I was describing it, but it also includes their material wealth and power in this age. Because in this age, the kingdoms of the world have a degree of power. They have a measure of power. And so Satan is offering Jesus another way. God's way of getting power and glory, it means suffering. And in Jesus' case, it also means poverty. I mean, later in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That's the life Jesus chooses. It's God's way. And Satan is saying, you don't have to go through that. It's all yours. Everything, the glory, the riches, the power, the dominion, all you have to do is worship me. God's way is too hard. So I hope we can see the test here. I mean, if you knew that in a few years' time you were going to be crucified, tortured to death, wouldn't this be a test for you? I mean, that's God's way, but I have to go through all that for him. He's known that for at least, presumably, his 13th year. Yeah, presumably. I mean, we're never told exactly what he knew, but at least as a 13-year-old in Luke's gospel, he knows enough to know who he is, what his role is. And at some point in his life, he knows the way of the cross. This is it. So several hands went up. Yeah, Sherman, go ahead.
It's amazing that all this is happening when he's in human form.
Yeah.
He's already, like you said, he's already aware of who he is. And somewhat the end game to it all.
Yeah.
But the devil continues to offer things that a regular human would bite off.
Yeah.
But Jesus has that part of the character and behavior of God because it's in him.
Yeah.
And the thing that you said about Israel, son of Israel, that Jesus was willing to suffer to accomplish the mission, whereby Israel, they had already been oppressed 400 years.
Yeah.
And they couldn't deal with 40 years out of Egypt.
Yeah.
They had saw all of God's things.
Yes.
Up front. And they succumbed to it.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. Sherman was just saying, look at Israel, and they went through 400 years plus of oppression in Egypt, and they can't go through 40 years of testing. And really, the only reason it was 40 years is because they initially got to the land and said, we can't take it. They lost their faith. But Jesus is now, remember, he's living in his own person Israel's history. The Exodus in Matthew 2, passing through the water in Matthew 3, the wilderness testing in Matthew 4. He's living Israel's history because he is the fulfillment of Israel, the champion who will succeed where the nation failed. I want to say one thing to what Sherman said. I'll get you in 1 second, Miss Rosemary, because Sherman just said something that I would quibble with here. Sherman said, Jesus is being tested in his humanity, but he's able to pass because he's God. Is that an accurate summary of what your point was? Is it accurate for me to say, it sounded like what you said was he's tested in his humanity because he's God in human form, but he withstands the test or he passes the temptation because he is God. Is that accurate? Okay. I would say this. It's not that what Sherman said is false. I wouldn't say that's false. But I would argue this. Matthew's point is not that Jesus is able to pass the temptations because he is God. That's not his point. He is emphasizing Jesus passing these tests in his humanity. He is a human being who stands toe-to-toe with Satan and withstands him. And the reason why I think that's worth emphasizing is because if we were to just say, well, he passed the test because he's God, that gets us off the hook. Like that allows us to just say, well, he's God, so he can do that. But the gospel authors don't emphasize that. Like they're emphasizing, no, in his humanity, he defeats Satan. He withstands temptation. And by that victory, as a human being, that victory is shared with us as human beings. So he's humanity's champion. And so I want to emphasize that. Again, it's not that what Sherman said is false. I would just say it puts as I've said before in another context, it puts the emphasis on the wrong syllable. It puts the emphasis on the wrong syllable. It's an emphasis that the gospel authors aren't quite making. They want us to see this as, no, a human being defeats sin. So so I just want to make sure that we're emphasizing that as well. And just kind of think about our wording. Again, not that what Sherman said is false, but the different emphasis I think is important. Miss Rosemary, you had your hand up. Yes. Yes. Miss Rosemary just brought up that other moment in Matthew's gospel where his flesh will be tested in Gethsemane. And how in that moment, we see his humanity coming through, where he's praying, please let this cup pass from me. But then he immediately does what he instructs his disciples to do in what we call the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, not my will, but yours be done. Your will be done on earth as in heaven. Even if that means I have to suffer. I want us to see the connection between the passion and the temptation in the wilderness. I want to make sure we're getting that connection. That what Jesus is going through in the wilderness is preparing him for that ultimate test where he's going to be tested Are you going to trust God? Are you going to wait for Him to deliver you? Are you going to put His will first above your own? Even if it means you have to suffer and be tortured to death. The wilderness prepared Jesus for all that. So that then when we get to the end of the gospel, even though He's wrestling in His humanity, He still says, your will be done. And I will suffer if this is what the Lord calls me to do. And then He's delivered. The resurrection is that deliverance. Like God allows Him to die. But He raises Him up to show, I'm vindicating this agent of my kingship, and this is the man that I've chosen to rule over the cosmos because of His obedience in His flesh, in His humanity. Yes. 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 And in turn, as Rosemary just said, and in turn, that victory is then shared with us. Those human beings who put their faith in Christ share in His victory because He is the representative of Israel. And so His victory becomes Israel's victory. And remember, Israel's victory means victory for the world. Because God had promised in the Old Testament, through Israel, my blessing will go to all the nations. I will redeem all creation through Israel. And Jesus, as Israel's champion, then fulfills that calling. Very good. So this is what Satan is offering Jesus, a way to glory and rulership without suffering. Let's go to our second question. How does this parallel Israel's experience? You know, we saw in the first two tests that what Jesus is going through paralleled Israel's test in the wilderness, except that Jesus passes where Israel failed. Well, let's look at this parallel. How does this test parallel Israel's experience in the wilderness? Go to Deuteronomy 6. And this is where we'll get the passage that Jesus quotes in response to Satan. Go to Deuteronomy 6. And let's read verses 10 to 15. And think about this question here as we read it. See if you can pick up on it. How is Jesus' third temptation a parallel to Israel's experience? Deuteronomy 6, and let's start reading in verse 10. And when Yahweh your God brings you into the land that He swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care, lest you forget Yahweh, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is Yahweh your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by His name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the peoples who are around you, for Yahweh your God is in your midst. For Yahweh your God in your midst is a jealous God, lest the anger of Yahweh your God be kindled against you, and He destroy you from off the face of the earth. It's verse 13 there that Jesus quotes in response to Satan. Now, how does Jesus' experience here parallel Israel's experience? Let me, for the sake of time, let me put my thought up here, and we'll just kind of dig into this. Jesus is going through a parallel test that Israel went through in the wilderness, and here's how I would summarize it. Both Israel and Jesus, their test involves turning to false gods for one's well-being. Both involve turning to false gods for one's well-being. In this context of Deuteronomy 6, Moses warns Israel. Again, if you look in verse 14, you shall not go after other gods. There is test number 3 in the wilderness for Jesus. Because what Satan is wanting Jesus to do is to choose another god that he will serve. In other words, Israel, as you know from biblical history, Israel struggled with idolatry in the wilderness. God's way is too hard. Let's turn to the gods of the peoples. Let's do it their way. Their way is more fun. Jesus is now going through that same test where now you have Satan saying, make me your idol. Make me your God. Worship me. My way is a whole lot easier than Yahweh's way, God's way. Just worship me. I'll give you all this. And so the parallel test here is, do we stay aligned with God? Do we put our faith and trust in Him, even if it means a wilderness experience of hardship? Or do we turn to the false gods and let's put our well-being into their hands? Let's trust them to give us what we want. Israel failed that test in the wilderness, turning to false gods. Their whole history is one of turning to false gods. But Jesus, as Israel's champion, quotes Deuteronomy 6:13 and says, no, I am only going to serve Yahweh. Even if that means a road of suffering, deprivation, I'm still going to trust in Him and His ways. And so Satan is offering Jesus the same thing that he offered the nation of Israel. God's way is too hard. Turn to me. Worship me. Fall to idolatry. And I'll give you what you want. That's the parallel here. What questions or thoughts do you have on this question, on this parallel between Israel falling to idolatry in the wilderness and now Satan testing Jesus with the same? Turn to another God. Worship me for your well-being. What questions or thoughts do you have on this? Yeah, Mr. Jim?
We have to watch out for Satan today, just like Israel did and Jesus did. Is he still making offers to us to get us away from the Lord?
Yes. Yeah, Jim just made a great application. In fact, one we'll talk about here in just a minute. That Satan offers us the same thing. Satan comes to us and makes that same offer. God's way is too hard. God's way won't allow you to do this over here that you know you want to do. God won't let you do that. I will. Turn to me. Or God's way involves suffering and persecution and saying no to things that you know your flesh wants. But if you worship me, I'll let you have all these things. Satan offers the same thing to us. And we'll say more about that in just a moment. But Jim's exactly right. Let me get Robert, and then I'll get Cornell. Attendance numbers. You know, Robert just said, look at our attendance numbers. And that can be a sign of priorities. Not necessarily all the time. I don't want to make a blanket statement. But yeah, Robert's saying, maybe Robert is saying it a little more emphatically than I would. Emphatically. He's and Robert may have more knowledge than I do as an elder. There's things he knows.
I'm just saying, if you read through Hebrews.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Do not forsake the assembly. Is that
10:26.
Yeah.
The word for. It's connecting the previous verses to the next verse.
Yeah.
The previous verses talk about not coming to the assembly.
Yes.
Or sin. It is sinful not to come to the church.
Yes. Yeah.
That is bottom line.
Yes.
It is sinful not to come to church or an assembly.
Yes.
We have an assembly 3 times a week. And it's not just because it's our tradition. We as elders have to feed the flock. That is our responsibility.
Yes.
Sunday night and Wednesday night is just as important to feed the flock. It is sinful not to feed.
Yes.
Emphatic.
Yeah. Robert's just. Yeah, that's right. Robert is emphatically making the point, and a connection that I agree with, that as we consider what God do we serve, part of that ripple effect, as you think about how does that manifest in all my different ways of life, part of that is going to be, do I choose to be with the assembly of God's people? Or would I rather, just watch Netflix or something, Go ahead.
I have become more emphatic. If Because of something you said at yes.
What did I say? Now he's blaming me for his emphatic. No, I'm just kidding.
Jesus wants to be with us.
Yes. Yes. Jesus wants to be with us. And so how are we reciprocating that? Yeah. Yeah.
How do we not want to be here?
Yeah.
This is the bride of Christ.
Yes. Yes.
Jesus wants to be with his bride.
Yeah.
Why doesn't the bride want to be with her husband?
Yeah. That's great.
I don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Yeah. No, that's a great.
I don't know how to save it for a plane.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't get why we have Christians who don't want to be here in the assembly to be with the bride who they confess and were bearing the baptism that said they wanted to be a part of this church,
Yeah.
and they will not come on a Sunday night.
Yeah. 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 No, great point. Yeah, yeah, it is a word. Yeah, that's right. No, great point. Great point. And it's something that every Christian needs to think about and consider. Cornell, you had your hand up. No, that's good. That's good. That's great.
Parallel, much so like Adam and Eve.
Mm.
Tempted by the devil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nothing on the side. The devil will go in,
Yes.
just like now.
Yeah.
So we still live in the same time.
Yeah.
Jesus says that he's the way, the truth, and the life. So he showed us how to defeat the devil. And it's basically by maintaining faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the easiest hard thing I say we have to do.
Yes, the easiest hard thing. Yeah, I like that. I like that. Yeah, Cornell just said, Satan's tactics are the same for all of us. We go through the same tests. There may be a different coat of paint on it, but it's the same issues that Satan brings up since the Garden of Eden. Eat this and you'll be like God. Even though we'd already been in God's image. He made us in His image. But Satan's always getting us to see, yeah, but God's way is just off. You want this. This is where you'll find true fulfillment. Your true destiny. Over here. Just do what I want you to do. Serve me. They had plenty of fruit. That's right. That's right. That's right. Very good. Well, here's our last question, and then we'll make some applications and be done. And I've kind of already alluded to this here. How does Jesus succeed where Israel failed? I'll just put my thought up here. Here's how I'd summarize it. He shows commitment to serving only Yahweh, regardless of what it will require of Him. He shows commitment to serving only Yahweh, regardless of what it will require of Him. That's how He succeeds where Israel failed. God's son Israel failed in the wilderness because their attitude was, God, we need meat. You brought us into Egypt to kill us. We need meat. We need bread. We need water. This land isn't good enough. We're not going to be able to take the land. All these tests and all these demonstrations that their ultimate God was not Yahweh. It was themselves. It was their appetites. It was the idols of the nations, because the idols let us do things that this holy God over here won't let us do. And so Jesus, when He now faces this test in the wilderness, He makes it clear, I will serve Yahweh alone. That's commandment 1 of the 10 commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. Israel couldn't keep that commandment. We can't keep that commandment. But Jesus did, 100% of the time. Only God, even if I have to go through a wilderness, even if I have to go through 40 days of hunger, even if I have to be nailed to a cross, I will only serve God. That's how He succeeds, where Israel failed. Now, let me close with applications here, and then we'll be done. Just 3 applications to take from this. The first two applications are in the form of questions that I think that this text forces us to wrestle with. Here's the first one. Is your commitment to God and God alone? Is your commitment to God and God alone? This third test in the wilderness forces us to examine ourselves and to ask ourselves, are we as committed to God as Jesus was? Now, it's easy for us to say yes to this question. Is your commitment to God and God alone? Oh, absolutely, Nathan. Yes, it is. But we need to think about how we live. Because our lifestyle may demonstrate that really we have God among many gods. It's God and money. God and power. God and sports. God and this woman. God and this man. Or whatever. Whatever things that we put in our lives ahead of God. Do we live the devotion to God that we say we have? And only we can answer that for ourselves individually. I can't answer that for Cornell. He can't answer that for me. But each of us has to wrestle with this question. Do we show this same commitment to Yahweh, where He alone is God, and we have no other gods before Him? Sister, what? Oh yeah, even children. Yeah. Are we putting God before children? You know, remember Jesus, later in this very gospel, will say, he who loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. And that would, by extension, include children as well. Now, this question is important, but it becomes even more important with the second question. Because this one's pretty easy to answer. Even though I've said when we look at our lifestyle, it may get a lot more muddy. But at least it's easy to answer this one verbally. But it becomes much harder when we come to the second question, which this episode is all about and forces us to confront. Is your commitment to God strong enough to endure suffering? Is your commitment to God strong enough to endure suffering? That's even harder to answer verbally. Even just a quick knee-jerk reaction where the first question we might say, yes, God and God alone, I'm there, amen. This one may even still give us pause, even just to answer it verbally. We're like, ooh, a little tougher. But the reason this question is so important is because what Jesus says later in this gospel in Matthew 16, when He tells His disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. In other words, if you want to be my disciple, here's a picture so that you can know what that's like. Carrying your cross to your own crucifixion site. That's what it means to follow me. Who would then raise their hand and say, oh, I'm there, first in line, let me be there. But Jesus is saying this is a requirement. This is not some like, yeah, if you want to be a really good disciple, you got to. All disciples, this is the requirement. You've got to be ready to crucify yourself. Literally, in that culture, which was much more of a possibility. I mean, is there any of us who would just say, I'm willing to be tortured to death for Christ? I mean, until we're in that moment, it's hard to know. But even if it isn't, the primary meaning here is literal crucifixion. Literal, you have to lose your life for Christ. Be willing to die for Him. But by extension, even living a life of metaphorical crucifixion, where we're giving up things that our flesh wants to do, things that we want, but we're going to say, no, we're going to crucify our flesh because that is unrighteousness. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do it God's way, even if I have to suffer in the flesh for saying no to that temptation. Are we committed to God? Is our commitment to God strong enough to endure suffering? And again, we can only answer this for ourselves individually and be ready to suffer for Christ. And then finally, one more. Here's our last application. One that I hope will be a comfort to us. Jesus knows what it's like to be tempted to betray God for earthly gain. Jesus knows what it's like to be tempted to betray God for earthly gain. Have you ever denied God, betrayed Him, so that you could avoid suffering? Have you ever betrayed God or denied Him because it meant you would gain something that you wanted? I have. Jesus knows what that's like, to be tempted. But He said no to that temptation 100% of the time. That's remarkable. I can't even fathom what a life like that would be like. To every time you're tested to say no. But His perfection is not a cause for our shame. It's not a cause for us to say, well, I can't go to Jesus because He's so perfect. It's the opposite. It's just as the Hebrew author has said, we do not serve a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. We serve a high priest who in every respect was tempted as we are, yet without sin. And so then here's the takeaway. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. That's Hebrews 4, 15 to 16. In other words, Christ's perfection in temptation is a source of our aid. It is not a source of our condemnation. So when we are tempted to betray God, to avoid suffering, or to gain some worldly possession, something that we want, go to Jesus and talk to Him about it because He knows what that's like. And He will give you the power to say no to Satan just as He did, so that you can share in His victory. So as Mr. Jim said earlier, we're going to be tempted. We have been and we will continue to be tested by Satan in this same way. Worship me, not God. His ways are too hard. Worship me and you don't have to suffer anymore. You can do whatever you want. But we can call on Christ, the perfect Son of God, the representative of Israel. We can call on Him, and by His power, we can say no to Satan so that he flees from us the way he fled from Jesus. And so may we show Satan, through Christ's power, may we show Satan that our devotion to God is to Him alone, and it is strong enough that we will even endure suffering to show our devotion. Well, next week, we're going to wrap up our examination of these temptation episodes next Sunday with just a few summary thoughts and a few additional things, and then we'll go ahead and move on in Matthew's text. Thank you so much for your kind attention today. God be with you this week.